Oh, I get to open it up. My goodness. Well, I'm Matt Valensic, for those of you who don't know me. And Jane's asked me to introduce Dave Tomashefski, our speaker for today. And so I gave him a call yesterday and talked to him. And this is a guy I'd like to spend a little time with in the future, but he sounds like he's pretty busy. So Dave is with Meadow City Native Plant Nursery in the Collinwood neighborhood of Cleveland. And he's going to talk to us about where did the pollinators go? Dave is responsible for educational programs and materials at Meadow City, and he's one of the founders with his friends Julie and Alyssa. They met in graduate school at Ohio State's School of Environment and Natural Resources, where Dave was focusing on ecological restoration. More on that in a minute. He received his master's in 2016 and then went to work for Ohio State's Soil Chemistry Lab, analyzing soil samples for the various research projects being done by faculty and staff, and students rather, at Ohio State. And when you look at it carefully, Meadow City Native Plant Nursery is providing some of the raw material for ecological restoration of our urban and suburban landscapes. Once we address the non-native invasives and get rid of them, then we can start restoring biodiversity by including a lot of native plants into our landscapes and getting them from sources like Meadow City Native Plant Nursery. I think it's a very important concept that Dave and his friends are into. And in my opinion, they're at the cutting edge of, are you ready? Saving the world 1 yard at a time. When he's not working, Dave enjoys nature walks, birding, and is interested in getting into nature and bird photography. We can talk about that sometime too. He's incredibly curious about everything nature-wise and uses iNaturalist to help him identify some of those plants and animals that he encounters in his forays into the woods. So without further ado, Dave Tomashefski, we're looking forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Matt. Okay, so now I'm gonna let's see. I'm gonna share my screen and I'm gonna get the slides up here. Let's see here. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, so okay, great. Can everybody see my screen then?
Looks good here.
Okay, perfect. That's all I need to know. All right. Yeah, thanks so much, Matt, for that wonderful introduction. And I'm so happy to be talking to the group today. As Matt said, my name's Dave, and I'm from Meadow City Nursery. And the title of this presentation, which actually Jane came up with, is Where Do They Go? And this question is really referring to where are our pollinators going when they're not visiting our flowers? So this could be in the wintertime after the flowers fade, or really any time of year. And the answer to this question is when they're not at our flowers, these pollinators are retreating to their places of shelter and nesting habitat. And as gardeners, if we know what habitat features these organisms are looking for shelter and nesting habitat, then we can include those in our gardens. And this is really the ideal scenario for many of our pollinators, and in part because lots of our pollinators have short foraging ranges. And this refers to the distance between their nesting habitat and the flowers where they're collecting their pollen and nectar. Just a few years ago, there was a study done that determined that the average foraging distance for our solitary bees is 450 feet. So these bees are only traveling 450 feet on average from their nest to the flowers where they're collecting pollen and nectar. And solitary bees account for 90% of the bees, bee species in North America. So really, the ideal scenario for these organisms is for their food source to be very close to the nest. So we want to be sure to provide those habitat and nesting features that these organisms need in the gardens where they're collecting those food resources. If we do this, our gardens become much more active and interesting places. It shouldn't be surprising that if pollinators are nesting on site in our gardens, the pollinator activity is going to be a lot higher at our flowers. Older established gardens that have pollinators nesting in the garden itself can have 3 or 4 times as much pollinator activity at the flowers as do newer gardens. And of course, that just makes everything more exciting for us when we go into our gardens to view those many organisms. We should also recognize as gardeners that now is a critical time to help our pollinators and just so many organisms throughout North America. Looking at Ohio specifically, we've had a 33% loss of butterflies just since the mid-1990s. That's 1 out of every 3 butterflies gone. There's been this drastic decline in butterfly abundance in Ohio. Across North America, there has been steep declines in certain bumblebee species. You've probably heard about losses in the rusty-patched bumblebee, perhaps the American bumblebee. In the past couple decades, they've been declining precipitously, so that now we have the situation where 26% of North America's 50 bumblebee species are threatened with extinction. And losses of pollinators have major impacts higher up the food chain. And this is especially apparent when we look at the relationship between moths and birds called aerial insectivores. The aerial insectivores are the birds that are eating bugs while they're on the wing. And these would include birds like swifts, swallows, flycatchers, and what's called the nightjars, which include birds like this nighthawk pictured here. The aerial insectivores have been declining kind of drastically since 1970, and the nighthawk, for instance, has declined 58% in that time frame. And it's speculated that a lot of these declines are due to decreases in moth abundance. And moths are some of those important pollinators that we want to provide shelter and nesting habitat to in our gardens. So let's return to that question, where do they go? And we'll answer it by describing a series of microhabitats in the garden that we can provide to these pollinators. So where do they go? Destination 1 is leafy lane. Leafy lane just consists of an area of fallen leaves in the garden. Frequently, we will use wood mulch as the ground cover in our gardens. But really what we should be using is fallen leaves. Wood mulch is great for getting a garden started. In combination with cardboard, it forms an outstanding smothering material that will eliminate pre-existing vegetation from a space and enable us to grow our native plants free of competition. However, over time, as that wood mulch breaks down, we don't want to replace it, but rather we want to put fallen leaves there in its place. You don't have to remove the wood mulch, but as it breaks down, you're just putting fallen leaves into your garden so that they become that substrate or ground cover over time. And the reason we want to do this is because there are a huge number of pollinators and other beneficial insects that are relying on those fallen leaves at various points in their life cycle. So these organisms are going to include lacewings, hoverflies, moths, butterflies, lightning bugs, and so many more. Moths and butterflies will frequently form their cocoons in the shelter of the leaf litter. This is going to provide concealment from predators, and it's also going to provide some degree of insulation during the winter months. Now, moths are going to take advantage of that winter insulation at different points in their life cycle, depending on the species. So one example here is going to be the caterpillar of the Isabella tiger moth, which is known as the woolly bear. Woolly bears are probably North America's most famous caterpillars. You'll frequently encounter these caterpillars in the fall as they are crawling across sidewalks, pathways, and other walking spaces. And what those woolly bears are doing is they're trying to seek out a patch of fallen leaves. When they find that place, they curl up under the fallen leaves and they hibernate through the winter. Woolly bears actually have some really fascinating physiological adaptations that allow them to survive winter stress in their caterpillar form. For one thing, the woolly bear can expel water from its cells into the space between the cells so that when that water freezes and expands, the cells don't rupture. This means that woolly bears can actually be frozen solid and then thawed multiple times during a winter, and they'll be fine. In the spring, they thaw out again and they can just proceed in their life cycle. Even so, the woolly bears are depending on those leaves to provide some degree of insulation and minimize those winter extremes. In terms of the food sources that you want to provide in your garden for the woolly bear, this is a caterpillar that feeds on a wide range of host plants. But even a caterpillar like that is going to have its favorites and its preferences. I can personally vouch for the fact that woolly bears like to eat late bone set. This photograph in the lower right portion of your screen is evidence of that. I took this photo just a little while back at one of the Lorain County metro parks. Now, in its adult form, the woolly bear becomes the Isabella tiger moth. And the Isabella tiger moth is going to be nectaring on a wide variety of flowers. So it's going to visit almost anything that you have growing in your garden. Okay, so the next stop that we're going to investigate on our journey through these different habitat features is fallen timbers. And fallen timbers just refers to one or more pieces of decaying wood, like an old log. And who's living in fallen timbers? Beetles and bees. So 30% of our bee species are nesting in above ground cavities. And oftentimes, these nests are being built in old insect burrows in dead wood. One of the bees that nests this way is the pure green sweat bee. So the pure green sweat bee is one of our prettiest bees. It has this bright green iridescent coloration, and it's also one of the most important pollinators of our forests. Some studies show that the pure green sweat bee accounts for 90% of the bee pollination that's happening in our forests. Now, this bee, though, it will frequently fly outside of the forest and it will visit our yards and gardens. When it does so, it's going to be obtaining nectar from a wide range of flowers, primarily flowers that have shallow corollas so that this bee can access that nectar easily. And one of those flowers is Golden Alexander. Now, when the bee is looking for a place to nest, it's specifically looking for a log in a shady, moist location. It will enter that log through an old beetle burrow, and it will enlarge that burrow, and it will create chambers for its developing larvae. Here in the bottom of the screen, you can see a nest diagram for the pure green sweat bee. Those dark spaces are the chambers that it forms for its larvae, and usually it will form the walls to those chambers by kind of gluing loose wood shavings together. And those wood shavings are the product of the beetle excavation, the beetle which has abandoned that burrow which the bee now occupies. So if you have a garden that happens to be shady, rather moist, if you put an old log in that space, you very likely may attract the pure green sweat bee to nest there. You might be saying, I don't know, I'm a little dubious. What are the odds this is really going to happen in my yard? And to that, I would respond with this example. Just this past summer, I was visiting some friends in Cleveland Heights. This is the home of Peggy Spaeth and John Barber. And we had a nice tour of their lovely garden. And it is, in fact, mostly a shade woodland kind of garden. Next to their patio, there was this old decaying stump. I took a closer look at the stump, and sure enough, there was the pure green sweat bee going in and out of the stump, building its nest. So that's a close to home example of how you can create and provide this nesting habitat in your backyard or garden. Now, as I mentioned, those pure green sweat bees, they're going to be occupying old beetle burrows. One of the main beetles that's responsible for creating those burrows is the Betsy beetle. This is a big beetle. It can get, 1.5 inches long, and it looks quite formidable. But it's a total pushover, very docile, and is really no threat whatsoever to a person. It would probably just scurry away if you were to approach it. But the reason I mentioned the Betsy beetle is, first off, they have a very important role in the carbon cycle and recycling and breaking down large pieces of dead wood. They'll chew it up, they'll feed on it, and they'll break it into a much more smaller pieces that are easier to degrade. And as I said before, those small pieces of wood, which are lining their burrows, the pure green sweat bee is going to use those wood shavings in creating the chambers for its larvae. The other reason I mentioned the Betsy beetle is because they have a very fascinating life history. These beetles are social. The older beetles will work together with one another in family units to raise the younger beetles. And as they are working together, they communicate with one another by producing these auditory squeaks. There are videos on YouTube where you can hear these squeaks. Researchers have determined that these beetles produce 17 different squeaks that have meanings that the beetles recognize. And these have to do with alerting one another to the presence of, a threat or a predator. They also have to do with, greeting and with feeding their young. So it actually has been found that the Betsy beetle's squeaking is the most elaborate system of auditory communication of any insect on the planet. So that's pretty impressive. And they range throughout Eastern North America, often in woodlands, but they will sometimes venture outside of those woodlands and take residence in a welcoming backyard. All right, moving on to the next destination that we're going to highlight in our tour of habitat features. This is stem hollow. Stem hollow just refers to hollow or pithy plant stems, which are used as nesting sites by many different stem nesting bees. So as I mentioned just a second ago, 30% of our bees are nesting in above ground cavities. Some of those bees are nesting in dead wood, but a lot of them are nesting in these dead plant stems. After the plants have died back, these bees are occupying those hollow and pithy plant stems to build their nests. Small bees, like the yellow-faced bee and the small carpenter bee, are able to occupy very narrow stems, whereas larger bees, like the leafcutter bee, are going to want to occupy larger diameter stems. So when we are creating nesting sites for stem nesting bees, it's really easy. What you want to do is, after your wildflowers have died back, at the end of the growing season, leave those dead stalks standing through the wintertime. This is going to provide shelter for lots of birds and small mammals during the winter months. Then in early spring, you want to cut those dead stems to 8 to 24 inches in height. This is going to be the exact kind of material that those bees are looking for when they're searching out a new nest site. Those fallen stems that you have, the part that you've cut off, you can just leave those on the ground as a form of mulch. Like we were saying, over time, you don't add more wood mulch, but rather you add leaves. This is another material that can act as mulch in your garden. The other thing that I would say about creating these nesting sites is, when you're working in your garden in early springtime, the ground is very soft and there can be lots of overwintering organisms that you don't want to disturb in terms of their habitat. So you've got to be very careful about walking in your garden really anytime, but especially in the springtime. So when you go to cut these stems to 8 to 24 inches in height, do so from the garden edge or from stepping stones that are placed in the garden. That way you can be sure that you're not disturbing any other sensitive habitat. Okay, so one of the bees that really likes to nest in these old flower stems is the small carpenter bee. Small carpenter bees are especially drawn to the old stems of wild bergamot, a flower that many of us have in our gardens. Now, the reason I highlight the small carpenter bee is because A, it's a very important pollinator that is visiting a wide variety of flowers, but also this bee has a fascinating life history, and I'm going to share that with you now. It's called The Tale of the Dwarf Eldest Daughter. So, when the mother small carpenter bee forms her nest, she is burrowing into a hollow or pithy plant stem, and she's creating a series of chambers for her larvae, as you can see down at the bottom of the screen. Now, in the very first chamber that she forms, she always lays a fertilized egg. In the bee world, the fertilized eggs become the daughters. So that first egg that she lays is always a daughter. Also, in that first chamber, she puts less pollen and nectar than she puts in the other chambers. This means that as that baby bee is maturing, it's going to end up being significantly smaller than its siblings. And you can see a picture here of this dwarf bee alongside her normal-sized mother. So once that dwarf bee has matured, she's in a tricky spot because she's consumed all her food that her mother left. And so now she's got to exit the stem in order to get more food. But between her and the entrance of the stem, all of her siblings are in various stages of development. So what this little bee does is she makes her way out of that stem one chamber at a time. She burrows through those divisions between the chambers and very carefully seals each one up as she goes. And she's careful not to disturb her siblings. Now, when she finally makes it to the end of the stem, that's where she finds her mother waiting for her. And at that point, her mother says, "Honey, I need you to run some errands." And she sends that little daughter bee out to collect more pollen and nectar to bring it back to the stem so that her and her siblings can make it through the winter. So this dwarf eldest daughter, she's really the hero of the story here. It's very much a Cinderella story. And I think that in many ways, she's kind of the spirit animal for anyone who feels there was some unfair sibling favoritism in the home. The dwarf eldest daughter carpenter bee really you know, a hero of the insect world. Okay, cool. So moving on to the next habitat feature that we can offer in our gardens, and this is called Mud Dauber Manor. Mud Dauber Manor just refers to those habitat environments that the mud dauber needs to build its nest. And the mud dauber is a common wasp throughout much of North America. It's a non-aggressive wasp, and it's a pollinator of a wide range of flowers. Now, the mud dauber is constructing its nest from wet or muddy soil, and it's oftentimes building that nest under the eaves of our home. So the mud dauber is in its pollination visiting a wide range of flowers. It's going to especially be frequenting those flowers that have shallow corollas so that it can access the nectar. And as I said, when the mud dauber is building its nest, it's looking for a place of consistently wet, muddy soil. And I would say that if you have a spot in your garden where there's some bare soil that's consistently wet or muddy, keep an eye on it. And if you see that mud daubers are visiting this soil, go ahead and let them be, leave them alone. Furthermore, if you find a mud dauber nest on the side of your house, under one of the eaves, leave that be as well, because that's going to be a place where the next generation of mud daubers are going to emerge, and they're going to be pollinating those flowers, like I mentioned. They're also predators of spiders. So if there are any, spider phobes out there, the mud daubers are on your side. And the other thing that I would say about the benefits that the mud dauber has to offer is that these old mud dauber nests, those are the perfect kind of nesting cavities for cavity nesting bees like leafcutter bees and mason bees. And so it's almost like those nests are serving a dual habitat feature or function, not only housing the mud daubers, but also housing these cavity nesting bees. So at the nursery, we had mud daubers all over the place because we're always watering the plants, and there were areas of bare soil that were, always wet. And I can attest to how docile the mud dauber is because, we're tromping and dragging our hoses among these wasps all day long, and we never had any, incidents. Another kind of charming story about the personality and ways and life history of the mud dauber is provided by Dr. Schaefer, who wrote The Ways of the Mud Dauber in 1949. So this is really kind of a heartwarming tale of a person's interactions with the natural world. When Dr. Schaefer retired from his role as a university professor, he didn't really know what he was going to do with the rest of his life. He had a lot of time on his hands. He was feeling lonely. And the mud dauber wasp, for some reason, aroused his curiosity. He launched into a period of 9 years of intensive study with the mud daubers, and he came to the conclusion that although their nervous system is quite small, mud daubers have the capacity to learn and show individual personality. He became quite attached to these insects, feeding them honey from his fingertips. And in certain cases, the mud daubers would become so affectionate toward Dr. Schaefer that they would be in his lab and potentially in contact with lab instruments that would be harmful to the mud dauber. So Dr. Schaefer would, in those cases, remove the mud daubers from the lab, and he would sense that the wasps would then give him the cold shoulder and kind of, react negatively. And in one case, he said that he thought that a specific mud dauber had really shut him out of his life because he had put this mud dauber out of the lab. But then a bit later, the mud dauber flew to him across his yard, landed on his finger, and he says at that moment, I felt as if I had been forgiven. So it's really kind of a nice tale about someone's connection to an insect and perhaps encouragement that you would want these beneficial insects in your yard. All right, the next stop in Pollinator Town, which is what you might want to call your garden as you put these various features into it, is something that I like to call beetle rock. And beetle rock just refers to one or more boulders or stones that you can put in your garden. And these are especially useful habitat features for ground beetles. So ground beetles are going to live underneath these rocks and stones because that's a cool, moist environment that is perfect for their well-being. You can very well imagine that the gardens become quite hot during the summertime, and these beetles are going to want a cool place to retreat to, and that's when they go under our stones. I'm sure that many of you have the experience of overturning a rock or stone and seeing all kinds of organisms sheltering there. And in Ohio, one of them is the big-headed ground beetle. This is a common ground beetle in Ohio. It has very large pinchers, is very formidable looking, but just like the Betsy beetle, it's merely going to scurry away if you approach it. And the reason that we want ground beetles like the big-headed ground beetle in the garden is because they are preying on garden pests. And the pests that they are targeting include aphids, snails, and slugs. We know how aphids can extract the sap and fluids from our plants, kind of hindering the overall health of the plant. Well, these ground beetles, when they emerge in the night, they are patrolling our garden space and they're eating the aphids. Similarly, slugs are oftentimes consuming our plants, impairing the health of the plant. The ground beetles are targeting slugs. So ground beetles are on your side, and if you want to encourage their presence in the garden, you're just going to put one or more rocks. Another thing that you can do with the rocks is stack them in a loose pile. Rocks that are arranged in a loose pile have cavities in between them, and these can oftentimes be occupied by leafcutter bees, which are cavity nesting bees. I mentioned them a minute ago in talking about the stem nesting habitat, but they also are nesting in cavities in between loosely stacked rocks. All right, the next habitat feature that I want to highlight for the garden is called Bumble Tunnel. And the reason that I'm calling it Bumble Tunnel is really just in reference to the fact that this is a home for bumblebees, and bumblebees are nesting in various cavities both above and below ground. So before we get into the specifics of the Bumble Tunnel habitat feature, let's talk a little bit about bumblebees and why they're so worthy as occupants of our gardens. So the first reason that I like to focus on bumblebees is because these are North America's most social native bees. Oh, just a second here. I want to check out the chat just in case anyone. Okay, great. So I'm getting some questions in the chat. I just wanted to make sure that, my audio hadn't gone out. I had this, terrifying vision that what if I get to the end of the talk and it turns out that you guys couldn't hear me for the second half of it, but that's not the case. Anyway, so here's a question that I'll address right now. And this is, what was habitat feature number 4? So let's go back and take a look real quick. For some reason.
Dave,
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
maybe Matt will field questions from the chat at the end if you want
Okay,
to.
sounds good. But
Yep.
yeah, all right. So I won't interrupt the talk from from here on out. But just to answer that question, since I'm here, habitat feature number 4, that's mud dauber manor, just referring to an area of wet or muddy soil in your garden. I would encourage you to leave that be if you see mud daubers visiting it. So yeah, but I'll reprise the talk at Bumble Tunnel. And what I was about to say was, why are we inviting bumblebees into the garden? And there are a lot of reasons. And the first reason that I would mention is bumblebees are fascinating creatures. And this is because they're North America's most social native bees. The vast majority of bees in North America and really around the world lead solitary lifestyles. This means that the mother bee is going to build the nest. She's going to stock it with pollen and nectar. She lays her egg. She seals up the nest. And then she flies away and probably only lives for a couple weeks after that. But bumblebees are different because they're highly social. And what this means is the mother bee, the queen, she actually works in cooperation with her offspring to raise additional offspring. And everyone has their assigned role. There's this division of tasks. So the queen bee, she's going to be insulating the eggs under a cover of wax, and she's going to be incubating those eggs. Her daughters, the workers, they're going to be going out and they're going to be collecting the pollen and nectar, which is going to be fed to those larval bees. They're also, cleaning the nest and assisting with the structural integrity of the nest. The sons, they're pretty much just focused on mating with bees from other colonies. But anyway, the idea is that the bumblebee has a really kind of complex social structure. The other reason why I like to focus on bumblebees as organisms that we really want to have around is because bumblebees are like super pollinators. All bees are outstanding in terms of pollination. 80% of the world's plants rely on bee pollination, but bumblebees are like, exceptional in terms of their pollinating abilities. And this is for a few different reasons. One of which is that the bumblebees have physical adaptations that allow them to pollinate the whole range of flower shapes. So I have these flower shapes shown at the bottom of the screen here. Flowering plants evolved these different flower shapes over time because they wanted pollinators that were visiting the flowers for nectar to come in contact with the plant's reproductive parts. The thing is that as they formed these different flower shapes, in some cases, they made it really hard for the pollinators to access the nectar. And if a pollinator can't access the nectar, it's not going to bother visiting that flower and pollinating the plant. That's why bumblebees are so special. They can access the nectar in all of the major flower shapes. This long tubular flower, the bumblebee has a weirdly long tongue, and it can access the nectar at the base of that tubular flower. So it's not going to ignore those tubular flowers like wild bergamot. It's going to be visiting and pollinating those flowers. Similarly, the bumblebee is big and strong. These flowers that have the bilabiate shape, or think about like bottle gentian, a flower, or let's see here. What's another good one? The blue lobelia, or monkey flower. These flowers that can be kind of difficult to open. Bumblebees are strong enough to open those flowers, get in and access the nectar, so they're not going to ignore them. Same thing with the carinate flowers. These are in the pea family. So think about wild blue indigo, baptisia. Those flowers are really tough to open up, but bumblebees are strong enough to do it, so they're going to be pollinating them. So bumblebees, you know, they're really extraordinary for their pollinating adaptations, and we want to do everything we can to encourage the bumblebee population to grow. One of those things we can do is plant the flowers that the bumblebees like the most. A research study done a few years ago determined that Culver's root is overall the #1 favorite plant of bumblebees. So plant Culver's root in your garden and you're going to be giving the bumblebees exactly what they want. But also, we want to provide the habitat features that the bumblebee needs to nest. So what does that mean? Bumblebees are going to be occupying cavities both above and below ground when they're nesting. Probably the cavities they're most often occupying are old rodent burrows. So think about old chipmunk burrows or old vole holes. I have one shown here. They're also going to be occupying the space under the thatch at the base of our grasses. Grasses like big blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, little blue stem, as they grow, their old stems tend to accumulate near the base of the grass in a layer called thatch. This forms a protective boundary against predators and inclement weather, and it offers space beneath the thatch where a bumblebee can build its nest. Here we have a picture of a bumblebee hiding in grass thatch. So I would encourage you to plant a grass such as big blue stem or switchgrass or little blue stem in your garden, because the thatch that accumulates at the base of that grass can be a perfect place for bumblebee nesting. Little blue stem is probably the safest bet in terms of planting a grass among your flowers, because little blue stem is not an aggressive grass and it typically won't outcompete your flowers. I would also say that in Northeast Ohio, we are especially well positioned for helping out bumblebees. 93% of the bees in Ohio are in a few common species, but the remainder of the bees are quite rare and they're of conservation concern. A study just a few years ago at Ohio State found that 3 of the 4 of these bees of conservation concern are most abundant in Northeast Ohio. And you can see them here: the half-black bumblebee, the golden northern bumblebee, and the confusing bumblebee. They're all concentrated in Northeast Ohio, which means that we're in a position to really help these bees out. I can attest to the fact that golden northern bumblebees are around. We have seen them at Meadow City. All right, moving on to our next habitat feature. This is the flats. And the flats just refers to an area of bare soil in our gardens, especially in a sunny situation. So I've talked about the 30% of bees that are nesting above ground, but what about the other 70%? They're nesting below ground. And a patch of sunny, bare ground is exactly what they're looking for when they're trying to access the soil surface and to build their nests. One of the bees that you are likely to attract to your garden if you leave a bit of bare soil in a sunny spot is the very smooth sweat bee. The very smooth sweat bee is going to be active throughout the summertime. It produces multiple generations of young, and this is one of the most important pollinators of flowers that have very shallow corollas. So these are oftentimes flowers in the aster family. So think about your asters, your goldenrods, your sunflowers. The very smooth sweat bee is one of the most important pollinators of those flowers. It also really likes swamp milkweed. So if you provide space for the very smooth sweat bee to nest, you might see a lot of them, because these bees nest in what's called aggregations. This means that multiple bees are building their nests in a small space. As many as 100 very smooth sweat bee nests can be formed in just a square yard of soil. But don't worry, the very smooth sweat bee is a very docile and not an aggressive bee. Another bee that you could attract to an area of bare soil is the Dunning's mining bee. The Dunning's mining bee is only going to be active in the springtime, and it really likes to visit our flowering trees and shrubs, especially hawthorn. The Dunning's mining bee is another one that nests in aggregations with lots of bees forming their own nests in a small space of soil. Okay, the final habitat feature that I'm going to highlight is brushfoot lodge. And brushfoot lodge simply refers to a brush pile. Brush piles are wonderful habitat features for virtually every organism that we've talked about so far. But the reason I call it brushfoot lodge is because this is the place that's going to provide winter shelter to the brushfoot butterflies. Brushfoots are a family of butterflies that include the grammatical butterflies, and these are the eastern comma and the question mark. If you wonder why it's called the comma, if you take a very close look at the center of its wing, it has what looks to be a comma inscribed on the wing. Similarly, the question mark has what appears to be a question mark. These butterflies blend in very well with the leaf litter, but during the winter, they are going to go to a sheltered location, such as underneath bark, a hollow log, a wood pile, or a brush pile, and they're going to hibernate throughout the winter months. Now, if you want to see these butterflies active in and about your garden, the best thing to do is to put out some fruit, because these butterflies actually feed on rotting fruit and tree sap more so than they do flowers. However, they will sometimes visit flowers, and flowers that they especially like are common milkweed and common boneset. The other organisms that are really going to love you if you have a brush pile are ground foraging birds. So this includes towhees, sparrows, and wrens. All of these birds are searching for various, seeds and also insect prey on the ground surface. And a brush pile is exactly the kind of habitat feature that's going to attract that insect prey and is going to provide good forage and shelter for these birds. When you're building your brush pile, it's best to start with the coarse logs and sticks, and then add finer sticks near the top of it. And don't pack the material in too tight, because you want to make sure that those birds and other organisms can get in there. So you want to have lots of openings that are at least 6 inches wide. Okay, well, that concludes our tour of the habitat features that are, excellent to add to your garden. And I would just love to invite you to Meadow City. We can talk about more habitat features. You can check out the plants that we have growing. We're closed for the season right now, but we will be reopening in May. Also, if you're really itching to plant some plants now, you can always order them online and schedule a pickup at the nursery by appointment. So thank you very much for having me as a speaker today. I hope you enjoyed seeing these various habitat features and will consider adding them to your garden. But now, if anybody has any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Dave, that was a fantastic talk. There are 2 questions, at least in the chat. And the first one says, does nitrogen play a role in why you should transition from wood chip mulch to fallen leaves as mulch as your garden matures?
I don't have a great answer for that question. I can tell you that many of the native flowers that we're growing in our gardens have fairly low nutrient demands, and you don't really need to be adding nitrogen or phosphorus fertilizers into your garden in order for these plants to do well. But it is definitely true that if you simply remove dead plant matter at the end of each growing season, you are gradually depleting the nutrients that are present in your garden. So if you don't want to have any net loss of nitrogen, then yes, any leaves that fall in the garden, you want to keep them there to decompose. And any dead stems, that die back at the end of the year, you also want to keep those in the garden long term. And that way you don't have a net loss of nutrients.
A great answer, and I see a challenge in there in a household where you have one person who is looking for a natural looking environment and another one who likes a cultured or very neat environment. That this is something that we deal with all the time in my house. I won't get into details, but
Oh no, absolutely, man. And it's a common issue. And I actually started a garden down in Columbus on a vacant lot. I was having a little bit of friction with the people living around there because it had a very kind of wild meadow appearance to it. What I'll say is, if you put a border around the garden, like a physical border, like a little fence, and you make sure to keep things trimmed, any branches that go outside of there, it in my experience, that really helps in making a natural garden kind of like aesthetically acceptable to people with traditional tastes.
great advice. Great advice. The next question has to do with how do you feel about leaving ginkgo leaves? Do they release too much nitrogen since they're not a native plant? Or do you know?
I know that different leaves are going to have different nutrient contents, and it very well maybe it sounds like the person asking this question has knowledge that ginkgos are higher in nitrogen than other leaves. I am not aware of any research or information that's out there that says don't let certain leaves persist in your garden. So I would be inclined to just keep those leaves like as part of the leaf litter, just along with all of the others. I think that a lot of the kind of organisms that are utilizing that leaf litter, they're in many cases simply looking for concealment and insulation. And I would think that the ginkgo leaves are going to provide that in a similar way to the other leaves.
Okay, switching back to critters here. Can you offer some other options besides Culver's roots, flowers for bumblebees, favorites of bumblebees?
Oh yeah, certainly. So, all right, let me think here for just a second about what some of our favorite bumblebee flowers are going to be. Okay, baptisias, white, blue, indigo, I'm sorry, white baptisia, blue baptisia. These are great for early season for bumblebees. Also, if you have like a shady garden, foam flower. Foam flower is primarily pollinated by bumblebees early in the season. Penstemon, Penstemon digitalis. This is a great bumblebee plant for the month of June. In July, I would say wild bergamot. Wild bergamot's got those long tubular flowers that favor long-tongued pollinators like bumblebees. When you get into August, a really nice one is going to be ironweed. Ironweed is, intensely purple, adds really something special to your garden aesthetic, and the bumblebees really like it. When you get into like September and October, I would say asters and goldenrods. Those are both what fall into the keystone category of flowers in terms of, outsized a support of biodiversity, and bumblebees love both of them.
Wow, that's good advice. First off, next thing is you're getting a lot of accolades from people thanking you and what a great talk it is. But there is another question here. I see so few areas where people are leaving leaves in the suburbs of Eastern Cleveland. How can I encourage, for example, my church to begin establishing soft landing areas beneath trees while giving in to the preponderance of mowed lawn?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you want me to talk to your church, I'd be happy to. I've got a presentation specifically focused on soft landings, so I'd be happy to come talk to your church. But also, there's there are some very nice online resources. If you just type in soft landings, you will find really cool kind of overviews of the soft landing concept. And if anybody who has a garden that is incorporating these habitat components or is focusing on native plants, especially if your garden's in the front yard, put up a sign. Passers-by then will, see, oh, I see the significance here. This is why there are leaves, on the ground surface there. This is why, this garden has these specific plants. So I think that signage, those online resources, those are great ways to get through to people.
And stay tuned because sometime in the next few months, we're going to have another talk. We just reviewed it the other day about the topic will be called, but will it be beautiful? It was the wife's question to her husband when he said, let's start adding native plants to our yard. And they're right in Cleveland Heights on a typical small lot. And it's going to be a fantastic talk. So you might learn some things from there too.
Yeah.
Again, more accolades keep pouring in here for you, Dave. Wonderful. Are there local examples of larger places that have more areas for habitat? I guess that's the same person there. Are there local examples of places that are creating habitat that you might be aware of?
Yeah, well, we've got so right next to Meadow City, the city has given us permission to do some, native plant gardening there. So we have a soft landings garden there right next to the nursery underneath the London plane tree. So if you want to see an example of it, that's one place you can go. And we're going to be, adding more gardens to that space. I'm sure there are lots of great examples. Our metro parks, oftentimes, near the nature center, they have really cool gardens and landscaping that are highlighting a lot of these different features.
Great. Another question here. Why do you recommend that the hollow stems of plants don't be cut to 12 to 24 inches until spring?
Yeah, that's a great question. And really the only reason there is because if you leave them standing throughout the winter, this provides shelter to birds and small mammals. But from a stem nesting bee standpoint, you certainly could cut them back in the fall. Like we were saying, in terms of aesthetics, everything's a compromise. Sometimes people in your house or your neighbors don't like the way that it looks if you leave these dead stems throughout the winter. In those cases, you might want to cut some of those stems in the fall rather than the springtime, just to keep those people on board with the project that you're doing.
Yeah. This person asks, I have a large vegetable garden in addition to lots of native perennials. However, I never hear anything about what veggies or herbs attract pollinators. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say that, so just, I don't have a lot of knowledge about this, but I will tell you that plants in the parsley family are frequently going to be a food source for black swallowtail caterpillars. People talk about this all the time, how I want to say parsley and dill are, they'll find black swallowtails on there. Golden Alexander's is a native wildflower in this family that those, caterpillars will also feed on. But if you're growing herbs, those herbs that are in the parsley family are going to support the black swallowtails. Also, any plant that you plant in your garden that is insect pollinated, as opposed to wind pollinated, that's quite likely going to be a pollen and nectar source for our, our pollinators, including our bees. So like tomatoes, for instance, now those are wind pollinated, but they still attract pollinators. And when pollinators manipulate those flowers in a certain way, which is called buzz pollination, the fruit that the tomato plant produces is larger and more abundant. So you could increase your tomato yields if you are attracting bees to your garden that are performing buzz pollination. And one of the bees that is a buzz pollinator is the bumblebee. All the bumblebees know how to buzz pollinate. But yeah, the short answer is really any of those garden plants that have showy flowers, those are attracting pollinators and giving them forage resources.
Great advice. A few years ago, I started adding native plants into my vegetable garden complex. I have a lot of raised beds with the idea that they will help to pollinate my insect pollinated vegetables. So it seems to work. One of the favorites is bone set, which I took one little cutting when we were weeding our phenology gardens at our master gardener headquarters, took it home and put it in a pot. And it has grown in spades. It stays confined, but you can keep cutting that thing in pieces every year and give it to your friends. But boy, it's just loaded with those sweat bees you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And you stand right there, get your cell phone camera very close, get really great pictures. None of those insects on that plant ever bother the people. So
oh yeah, no, it's amazing. And absolutely, the bone sets are some of the best plants in terms of attracting our pollinators. That's a great strategy for your vegetable garden to plant the native flowering plants close to it to bring in those pollinators. And there's plenty of good research out there showing that when you do that, it increases the yield from your garden. Another plant that I really like for that purpose is early goldenrod, because this goldenrod is blooming in July. So that's right at the peak when you're doing a lot of your vegetable gardening. And I mean, it's just a total, pollinator magnet.
Yeah. And some of us who like to plant later, maybe not till the 1st of July, need those insects later in the season too. Because sometimes you can have challenges with your vegetables planted in late May or the first week of June. So if you plant at the end of July, or I'm sorry, beginning of July, you can still have crops, but you need the insects for the insect pollinated plants.
Yep, definitely.
Well, I think that takes care of all of our questions, Dave. What a fascinating discovery. You're just a storehouse of knowledge. I hope you have some other talks that we can have you back again for. Jane Ellison, I'm going to ask you if you have anything else for the good of the order, and I will go ahead and step aside here at this point.
Well, I just wanted to announce next month's presentation, which is going to be kind of a redo of what we did here last summer. It's going to be Harvey Webster, and oops, do I need a camera on? Maybe. And he is going to be talking about the 6 great extinctions, and it will be with slides. We had some interference last month, and okay. We had some, oh, there we go. We had some interference when he did it before, so we're going to do it again. And every time he does it, it's different. And that will be on December 11th. And so we're excited about that. And we look forward to seeing you all then. And maybe we'll also have a few suggestions about what Christmas presents to buy for people. So thank you all for attending. This was really fun. And thank you, Dave. That just always inspirational to hear all you have to say. And we can't wait till you open up again in the spring.
Oh yeah, thanks a lot, Jane. This was really fun.
Yeah, great.